Hello, everyone. In this session, we will be discussing a high-level introduction of the FDA. So you may have heard of the FDA, but you may not have any idea about what they do, their processes, where do they engage with companies developing a treatment, things like that. So today, we will be discussing some of that. Before we get started, I would like to thank our corporate partners and individual donors. Thank you so much for making these programs possible for us. I would like to introduce our wonderful speaker for this discussion, Dr. Yvette Kasamon. Dr. Kasamon is the acting clinical team lead for the Division of Hematologic Malignancies 2 for the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, FDA. She is also an adjunct associate professor of oncology at Johns Hopkins University. So I will go ahead and turn things over to you, Dr. Kasamon.
Thank you, Hillary, and it's a pleasure to be able to participate in this wonderful event. So again, my name is Yvette Kasamon, and I'm a medical oncologist, hematologist at FDA, and I'm specifically on the team that focuses on reviewing drugs for patients with lymphoma. A brief outline for what we'll go through today. First, I'd like to give just a very general overview of the drug approval process at FDA and focus on how we're working to advance drug development for serious diseases like lymphoma. Next, I'll briefly highlight some of the FDA-approved drugs for cutaneous T-cell lymphomas, and then end with how we're increasingly trying to capture the patient experience throughout the drug development process and the FDA review process. There are no conflicts of interest, but the views that I'll express today are my own and not necessarily formal position statements of FDA. So what is our mission? The FDA is responsible for protecting the public health. We regulate not only drugs and biological products, but also medical devices. And we're also tasked with ensuring the safety of the food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. In my division, we're focused specifically on reviewing drugs for patients with lymphoma and sometimes drugs for patients with other kinds of lymphoid malignancies. Importantly, what don't we do? We do not take into account cost or payment issues. We know that this is a big issue, but it's necessary to keep our drug approval decisions objective. We also do not regulate practice of medicine. So when a product is approved for marketing, it can be used as the prescribing provider sees fit. So today I'll focus on drug development in oncology and specifically later on for cutaneous lymphomas. The review of the marketing application and ultimately the decision to approve or not approve a drug is a big part of what we do. But FDA's role is much broader than this. It starts even before the first in-human trial starts and continues as long as the drug is on the market, with multiple steps and interactions along the way. We'll next go through some of these steps. Before a drug developer can begin clinical trials with their drug in the United States, they must submit what's known as an investigational new drug or IND application to the FDA. Among other components, the application includes detailed descriptions of the planned clinical trial. FDA also has an option for a program called the Pre-IND Consultation Program, which is designed to encourage pharmaceutical companies to initiate discussions with us early in drug development. This allows the company to receive advice from the FDA in order to help plan their studies. So after submitting the IND, the drug developer or researcher must wait 30 days before starting the trial to allow us time to review the application. Safety is the focus of this multidisciplinary review. The main goal is to make sure that participants in the clinical trials would not be subjected to unreasonable risks. If we find a problem with any portion of the IND application, we can order a clinical hold to delay start of the study and request additional information or changes. But if no hold is issued in the 30-day period, the clinical trial can begin. Clinical trials often take several years to complete, and the clinical testing of a new drug may go on for many years. But if the results of the early trials are encouraging, the company will move on to conduct later stage trials. As a general rule, the earlier phase studies focus more on safety and determining whether the drug has some signal of activity, and the later phases are designed to demonstrate whether the drug provides meaningful benefit to patients. We'll go through in more detail some of the considerations about clinical benefit later. But throughout the clinical testing stage, the drug developer must keep the FDA updated on any major safety issues that arise and the status of their clinical trials. And they meet with FDA at critical time points throughout the clinical testing stage. And this is to report the results of the completed trials, but also to obtain input and advice on the design of future clinical trials that they may be planning. And this is all designed so we're able to facilitate more efficient and successful clinical development of new drugs. So if the clinical trials appear successful, the company then submits what's called a new drug application, NDA, or a biologics licensing application, BLA, depending on the kind of the product. This application contains all of the documentation needed to tell the drug's entire story. And typically, these applications can be over 100,000 pages in length. In some circumstances, a public advisory committee meeting is held to discuss the application, particularly if there are some complicated aspects to the decision. If a drug is approved, it can be marketed to physicians and patients. If a drug is not approved, it cannot be marketed. Drugs can go through more than one round of applications before they are approved, and some have major problems and will never be approved. And then once it's approved during the post-marketing stage, we also have programs in place to monitor for the safety of the approved drugs. Just a quick note on expanded access. What is expanded access? It's using an investigational drug to treat patients with a serious disease, like lymphoma, for instance, who have no other satisfactory treatment options. The focus and the intent here is treatment of the patient. It's also called compassionate use. This is in contrast with the clinical trial, where really the main intent of the trial is research. There are some cautions with these expanded access programs because the risk of the drug hasn't been fully established for the investigational drug, and we really don't know with certainty what the potential benefit is, and that benefit might be overestimated. But some potential reasons for requesting expanded access may include not being eligible for a clinical trial, but potentially the benefit of the drug seems to maybe outweigh the risks. Patients may receive benefit while participating in a previous clinical trial, and now that trial is no longer open. Or perhaps the drug is not currently being developed, but may seem to have the potential for benefit for the patient. And perhaps the drug might have some promising evidence of activity in a similar disease that's not quite like the patient's disease, but has some parallels. But let's now move on just briefly to the main ways to get drugs approved for serious conditions in the US. There is the traditional or the regular approval pathway. And then for serious conditions like cancer, there is something called the accelerated approval pathway. And which pathway we go towards depends mostly on the primary endpoint of the clinical trial, meaning the main way that the trial is measuring the effectiveness of the drug. So one really critical question when we're evaluating a clinical trial is, well, what question is the study asking? As I briefly mentioned before, in the early phases of development, the trials are mainly focused on, is the drug active, and also, what is the safety and the proper dosing of the drug. In the later phase developments, the main question is, well, does the drug actually provide clinically meaningful benefit to the patient? So a drug can be active against a disease. For instance, it can cause a tumor to shrink, but it may not necessarily have a meaningful benefit to patients. And this is a critical distinction when we review drugs for marketing applications. If we don't distinguish between these important differences, there may be a waste of resources, and too many patients could be subjected to unacceptable risks. As an example, developing a drug that might work but is too toxic to have a good benefit risk balance. So let's focus on this a traditional or regular approval. This requires substantial evidence of effectiveness. Importantly, it's based on a direct measure of clinical benefit, meaning how a patient feels, functions, or survives, such as a longer life or a better life in terms of, for instance, quality of life. Accelerated approval is a way potentially to get promising drugs approved quickly for patients with serious conditions. It also requires substantial evidence of efficacy. But in contrast to the regular approval, which is based on a direct measure of benefit to patients, it's based on an outcome that's reasonably likely to predict benefit. For instance, a response rate, meaning how much a tumor shrinks. This drug also has to be evaluated in the context of available treatments. So in order for a drug to get accelerated approval, it's not enough that the effectiveness of the drug is encouraging or that the trial is positive, but the drug also needs to have an advantage over available therapies for the particular disease. So whereas there is some uncertainty with this efficacy endpoint in accelerated approvals and whether there's ultimately clinical benefit, accelerated approvals have been subject to the requirement the company studies the drug further in post-marketing clinical trials. These studies would generally be underway at the time of the accelerated approval and need to be carried out with due diligence. Response rate, or tumor shrinkage, has the unique benefit in that it can be interpreted in the context of a single-arm trial or a non-randomized trial. And it's been an endpoint that's been used commonly to support accelerated approval for lymphoma drugs. A strength of this response rate is that it's a pretty quick way to measure whether or not the drug is working. And that results in faster trials and also potentially fewer patients needing to be enrolled on these trials. But the key limitation is the fact that improvement, for instance, on a CT scan isn't necessarily a measure of benefit. What if there's just a shrinkage on a CT scan of a lymph node or a lesion that's not causing any symptoms? Will that predict an improvement in how a patient is feeling or functioning or surviving? And sometimes the particular tumors can also be difficult to measure. Case in point here in this example of a patient with skin lymphoma. But just like some responses are not necessarily meaningful to the patient, on the other hand, disfiguring skin lesions that achieve near complete remissions, or some angry and very itchy or uncomfortable skin manifestations of cutaneous lymphoma is an entirely different context. For one drug called romidepsin, which is actually the drug that was used in this particular patient here, response rates actually led to traditional or regular approval based on durable deep responses where the location of the tumor increased FDA certainty that there was real clinical benefit, for instance, in the form of cosmetic improvement or improvement in the symptoms from the skin lymphoma. So to summarize the approval pathways, it all comes down to the endpoint. Here, as we move from left to right, we're moving from endpoints measured earlier in the disease course, such as response rate or tumor shrinkage, to later endpoints that measure clinical benefit more directly, such as survival. In general, as certainty that you are either measuring or accurately predicting clinical benefit with an endpoint increases, regular or traditional approval becomes the more appropriate pathway. So there's a challenge with drugs for patients with cancer in that, obviously these can be life-threatening diseases, and that's allowed us to have greater regulatory flexibility in deciding what drugs to approve. So in terms of safety, historically, for cancer drugs, we've accepted a higher degree of toxicity. In terms of the bar for efficacy, we've been more often accepting a single-arm trial rather than 2 or more trials or randomized phase 3 trials. And we frequently use this accelerated approval pathway in order to get promising drugs to patients more quickly. But overall, at the end of the day, we need to determine whether the risk versus benefit balance is appropriate for a particular drug in order to support marketing the drug. And that considers more than just the safety and efficacy of the drug, but how much benefit, how much risk, what are the specific uses and the specific patient population, what are the available other therapies, if any. So these are all critical considerations that go into the decision to whether or not we ultimately approve the drug for patients. So for serious medical conditions like lymphoma, applicants can take advantage of 4 what are called expedited programs available from FDA. And the goal of these is really to streamline the drug development and approval process to be able to get promising drugs to patients with serious conditions in an expedited fashion. So fast track designation can be granted to a drug that's intended to treat a serious condition, and either non-clinical or early clinical data demonstrate the potential to address an unmet medical need. This program has the lowest requirements in terms of level of evidence. Next, you may have heard of breakthrough therapy designation. This is a higher bar. And this can be granted to a drug that's intended to treat a serious condition, and early clinical evidence indicates the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement over available therapies. And breakthrough therapy designation features intensive guidance from FDA on efficient drug development. Both of these designations, the fast track and the breakthrough therapy, provide the ability for the drug developer to meet regularly with the FDA for guidance. Once the drug is submitted for its marketing application, it can be assigned priority review. That means we have a shorter window of time to complete our evaluation. And it can decrease FDA's review clock by 4 months. And we then finally mention accelerated approval, which is an approval pathway that can be granted to a drug that provides a meaningful advantage over available therapy. But with the approval of cancer drugs, it's really challenging to strike this balance. There needs to be a balance between having enough certainty on the effectiveness and the safety of the drug versus the need to get promising drugs quickly to patients in need. And this is a balance that we're continually trying to achieve, and can be very challenging. But suffice it to say that we are really dedicated to getting promising drugs to our patients quickly, for patients who have serious medical conditions, but we also take a very, very close look at safety to feel comfortable that the potential benefits of the drug overall outweigh the potential risks. Next, I'd just like to highlight some FDA approvals for patients with cutaneous T-cell lymphomas. So this is apart from therapies that may be given directly to the skin or to radiation treatments. These are drugs that are given to target the entire skin. And so the most recent approvals, which I'll highlight in the next slides, have both been based on randomized phase 3 trials. Mogamulizumab, which is an antibody drug, was approved in 2018 for patients with mycosis fungoides or Sézary syndrome after at least one other systemic therapy. And a year before that, Brentuximab Vedotin, also called Etcetras, was approved for a specific type of skin lymphoma called anaplastic large cell lymphoma of the skin, or to certain types of mycosis fungoides after systemic therapy. And there are other approvals that are listed here. All of these drugs have regular approval. You can see that the earlier approvals were based on single-arm studies, meaning non-randomized trials, whereas the bar has been higher lately, where the most recent approvals have been based on randomized controlled trials. Brentuximab Vedotin is a type of antibody drug that received regular approval approximately 3 years ago for certain skin lymphomas after systemic therapy. So it's an antibody drug that binds to this protein on the cell surface called CD30, but it's not just an antibody drug, it's actually joined or linked with a chemotherapy drug. So the idea is that the drug's given by vein, intravenously, the drug comes and it binds to the CD30 on this lymphoma cell, and then once it binds, it gets internalized into the cell. And only when it's inside the cell, ideally, is the chemotherapy portion of the drug released. And so it's like administering the chemotherapy selectively to the cells that are being targeted, causing cell death. And so approval was based on a randomized controlled trial of Brentuximab Vedotin versus physician's choice of a couple of agents. And you can see that the rate of responses that lasted at least 4 months was higher with Brentuximab Vedotin, as was the complete remission rate, and progression-free survival, meaning the time that a patient stays alive without the lymphoma growing. Mogamulizumab received regular approval 2 years ago for mycosis fungoides or Sézary syndrome after at least one systemic therapy. And this is another antibody drug that targets a specific protein called CCR4, which is expressed on the surface of some lymphoma cells. And the approval was based on one of the largest trials conducted in patients with cutaneous lymphoma, where patients were randomized to receive either mogamulizumab or another standard of care drug called berinostat. And you can see that with the mogamulizumab, there was a longer progression-free survival, which was statistically significant, as well as a higher response rate. This drug had received breakthrough therapy designation a year before its approval, based on early results from this trial. And it's the first drug that's approved specifically for patients with Sézary syndrome. So in summary, taking a bird's eye view, the FDA bases decisions on the risk-benefit profile of a drug for a population of patients, but the treating physician must assess the risk-benefit profile for the individual patient, taking into consideration, for instance, the patient's medical history and whether the patient is similar enough to the types of patients who took part in the clinical trial. Circling back to drug approval pathways, since clinical benefit is considered an effect not only on survival, but how a patient feels or functions, there are other ways to look at a product's effect on clinical benefit, and that is looking at the patient experience. So regular approval of a drug or biologic, as previously mentioned, requires substantial evidence of safety and efficacy based on demonstration of a longer life or a better life or some combination thereof. So in oncology, we've been focused mostly on measures like tumor shrinkage or prolongation of life through overall survival endpoints, but increasingly, drug development has become more patient-centered, and patients are telling us they would like to know more about how they feel and function. So how do we measure a better life? One way is to directly ask the patient through surveys, for instance, and questionnaires, how they are feeling, how is their pain, how is their energy level, how is the itchiness of their skin, for instance, how is their overall energy and functioning. So the strength of this sort of endpoint is that it can be a direct measure of clinical benefit if it accurately measures how a patient is feeling or functioning. But the limitation is that although what you are measuring is strong, how to measure it is the challenge. And there's intensive, dedicated research into really answering just this question. And these patient-reported outcome assessments should be held to the same standard as other clinical trial measures of effectiveness. Importantly, patient-reported outcomes can inform drug development. For instance, patient-reported outcomes, or PROs, can help inform the side effects and the tolerability of a drug early in a clinical trial. And there's actually a measurement system that is focused on capturing adverse events or toxicities as reported by the patient, as opposed to how it is reported by a healthcare provider. As I'll show in the next slide, data on patient preferences can also help inform the dosing regimen or the route of administration, such as intravenous versus subcutaneous versus oral. And patient-reported outcomes can support the FDA's benefit-risk assessment throughout drug development, including after the drug is actually approved. So since these PROs are generated directly from the patient, the data are very meaningful and valuable and can be used to support the assessment of benefit and risk, especially when looking at how a drug affects the way a patient is feeling and functioning. And there's increasing interest in collecting these sorts of PRO data in clinical practice. And these sorts of measures, these PRO measures, are becoming more and more common at FDA and is an increasingly important component of our FDA review. And it's critical to treat these sorts of measures as we would any other clinical trial measure. So now an example of how FDA incorporated patient preference data into the drug review process. As some of you may know, Rituxan, or rituximab, is an antibody drug directed against CD20 that's approved for certain B-cell lymphomas and CLL. It's an IV drug that is infused very slowly over 1.5 to 4 or more hours because of the risk for potentially serious infusion reactions. Now, more recently, a different version of rituximab called Rituxan Hycela, rituximab and hyaluronidase, was approved in 2017. It's a newer subcutaneous or under the skin route for the same oncology indications. So it's infused subcutaneously into the abdominal wall over 5 to 7 minutes. And the approval was based on a dedicated study evaluating patient preference for subcutaneous versus IV Rituxan. Now, it goes without saying that patient preference in and of itself would not be sufficient for approval in this case. But it was instead accompanied by studies looking at safety and efficacy of the product. But I'd like to focus on the patient preference data. So if efficacy and safety are comparable, a 5 to 7 minute subcutaneous infusion is at least a potential benefit over a many hours long infusion. So this was an example of the questionnaire that was given to patients on this trial. So patients with certain types of lymphoma were randomized to essentially receive the subcutaneous version followed by the IV version, or vice versa, IV version followed by the subcutaneous version. And a questionnaire was administered to see what method of administration the patients preferred and why. And so in this case, the vast majority, more than 3/4 of the patients in this large randomized trial preferred the subcutaneous delivery over IV, with the most common reason being that the administration required less time. A small fraction of patients, 11%, preferred the IV version, and for this group, the main reason was that injecting the drug underneath the skin was uncomfortable. But it's these sorts of data that actually was one of the main bases for approval of the drug. And this sort of data actually appears in the US prescribing information, or the label, for Rituxan Hycela. And so, as a bird's eye view, patients can be incorporated into drug development from the very beginning, through the earliest translational trials, early clinical trials, where we can ask, well, what matters most to patients? How can it be measured? What patient outcomes should we be measuring? And how can we make trials be more patient-friendly? And then we can ask, well, once the trial's been completed, how can these patient data be integrated into our determination of overall benefit risk? And we're also studying ways of looking at patient-focused drug development post-marketing by asking, how can these sorts of clinical outcomes data be generated in a post-marketing setting, and how can they be best communicated? So, in summary, patient-focused drug development must be a dialogue. It takes into account the expertise of the patients and the expertise of the clinical trialists together to create a drug development strategy that is patient-centered but still scientifically rigorous. The drug development process is becoming a more patient-centered process. Again, measurement of the patient experience can complement existing measures of safety and efficacy. And as shown, patient-reported outcomes can inform the entire drug development process, and is an increasing area of focus and an ongoing initiative at FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of multiple FDA colleagues in providing these slides. And I'd like to end just with a summary of some FDA resources, both for cancer patients and advocates. We have contact information for the Oncology Center of Excellence with our website listed here. Here's a list of recent approvals for hematology and oncology. There's actually a soundcast that's available, cutely named Disco. And then there's also a section at the main FDA website that's dedicated to for patients, and talks about things like expanded access, the calendar for public meetings, engagements with patients, the various collaborative endeavors, and other resources. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Again, it's been a true pleasure to be invited to participate in this meeting. And I'll turn it back over to Hillary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kasamon. We're really grateful for your time and your expertise, and thanks for sharing such valuable information with us today. You know, the FDA can sort of be a black hole for folks, so it's really nice to understand what it is that they do and learn a little bit more about it. So thank you so much. And before we go, I would like to thank our corporate partners and individual donors for your continued support in making these programs possible. Thank you all for joining us for this session. We really hope that you found it informative. Please make sure to check out the other available sessions in our 2-day curriculum. And if you would like to go back and reference this particular session, it will be available on demand on our website following the event. Thank you so much.